Headphones. Don't need those for the recording. For some of you, this may be a little bit of an out-of-nowhere rumination, especially since it's not really one I've hinted at all that much, but this was a request for someone who was willing to donate for it. That actually didn't end up happening. But nevertheless, this was a game that I was at least willing to look at and decided to go ahead and give a little bit more of a analysis of it. Basically, if I had spare time to go ahead and play it. And as it happened, I managed to burn through the game in basically a couple days, so that worked out. Naturally, I didn't do a lot of the side quest stuff, so there's that. So, fair warning, this is disregarding some of the side quest things. However, that is not disregarding the freaky ghost woman who died years earlier side quest thing. Now that I've told you how I'm totally unqualified to talk, I'm going to talk for a little bit. I also don't know how long this is going to be. I only have a page of notes here. But I'm going to do my best, and I'm going to be honest, just like I always am. Far Cry 3 is a game I initially dismissed, more or less completely. Twice, actually. First, well, actually, technically 3 times, but first it was a continuation of the Far Cry series. I've never been into the Far Cry series, ever. It's never been my cup of tea. It's just like, okay, it's a moderately interesting set piece, and that's about all I had to say about it. Then I saw what kind of game it was initially portraying itself to be, which was, you get to roam this island and kill people and do all sorts of things with animals and, do kind of quests, missions. It's not quite a sandbox, first-person sandbox, but it kind of is at the same time. It's hard to explain the particular genre that Far Cry is, so I think we'll just kind of go with first-person sandbox, FPS, haha, and leave it at that. But I looked at it and I was like, okay, that looks interesting, but not really my thing, right? And believe it or not, I know this is going to sound really weird to some of yours, but sandbox games in general aren't really my thing. There are certainly some really well-done sandbox games that I love the hell out of. I've played several on the stream, and I've done several videos about them. But this one I was just, Then I looked more into it and saw how disgustingly, horrifyingly, disturbingly awful it was, and I said, no, this is definitely not a game for me. So I just put it away. In total frankness, if it were not for the fact that it was up for subject of being requested, and had been requested by one particular individual several times, but also by several other individuals, and was actually on the list of patron requests, I wouldn't have played this game. That being said, one of the most interesting things about Far Cry 3 is, and it's funny because I just did a video about Portal and Dark Souls, both of which are highly interpretive works. And I swear I didn't plan this, but that's also on the heels of talking about the Thrawn trilogy, which I spent a while talking about how books in general are highly interpretive works. But Far Cry 3 is a highly interpretive work. There's no getting around it. A lot of what is presented to you is done in a style in which you can't actually be sure of what's happening. They deliberately go out of their way to show you things that you know are not happening, and then they show you things that might be happening. And the whole time you're just kind of an in-betweeny stage. There's a lot of little tidbits that lead to the overall conclusion as well, that the whole island is basically screwed. For those of you who do not know, and I can't imagine it's any of you, the island that the archipelago really, but the place that Far Cry 3 takes place on, has the plant life there has basically evolved a natural defense mechanism, which boils down to everywhere you are, you're constantly breathing poisonous, toxic, hallucinogenic, mood-altering spores and fumes and all that fun stuff. That basically explains everything about this island, although I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. But my point is, between that and the fact that you are drugged, attacked, nearly killed multiple times, and which may or may not have happened, and hallucinate constantly while you're here, it's actually debatable what really did happen in this game and didn't. But that's just one step. That's like the most obvious and most blatant thing. There's lots of little touches that allow you to kind of determine your own character arc through this thing, which leads me nicely to my next point. This, and it just struck me as soon as I thought about it, this is a Greek tragedy. A classic example of one, actually. Probably one of the most straight examples of a classic Greek tragedy I've seen in a long time. Now, of course, I know that I'm going to get a billion comments saying, well, no, this is a better example of a Greek tragedy. And I'm going to say, well, you're right. But it really, the fact is, this struck me in a way no other game or book or movie has in quite a while in that respect. To make this clear, I am not saying that's a bad thing, okay? I'm not trying to accuse this game of being boring or disinteresting or using a hackneyed plot device or whatever. I'm just saying, if you look at the overall course of the game, let's do a quick summary here, shall we? You are someone who comes from a world of relative comfort, relative luxuries, and basic things that, honestly, we now in real life probably wouldn't consider luxuries, but when you think about it, really are. And not to drive the point home, but you watching this video right now is actually a luxury when you get down to it. My availability to play this game was a luxury. My availability to make this video is a luxury. If this was the world of World War Z, my job of doing all these deconstructions analyses would be completely defunct, to name one example. So, yeah, this gentleman comes from a life of relative luxury, and definitely comes from he basically takes a fall. He has definitely considered himself untouchable. It never occurred to him that he would have to deal with hardships in life, etc. Plummets pretty much as far and hard as he can, slowly crawls his way back up, kind of has some things going on with his character as he goes, and no matter how the game ends, there's two endings, spoiler alert, no matter how the game ends, it's bad, in one way or the other. I'll be talking about that later. But that is pretty much classic formula, especially the way that the main hero's friends are constantly in danger, and there's a great deal of emphasis on the similarities in characterization between villains and protagonists, and the semial antagonists or semial protagonist, excuse me, all that fun stuff, right? Really good stuff. The thing I find most interesting is the moment the player character decided to go to this island, to do the skydiving, his life was basically forfeit. We find this out later, and it actually was never confirmed in-game. The developers had to confirm it in an interview thing, that Doug, the guy who did the skydiving, he's like, hey, you should go to this island. He actually was working for Voss, and he was someone who, it deliberately leads, gullible, stupid kids, like the college kids in question here of the main characters, to their dooms to become human slaves. Actually, when I think about that, that might make him one of the most horrible people in the entire game. And I just feel like commenting on that because he's one of the only people who doesn't die in this game. I don't consider that a spoiler alert, by the way. It's a violent game about it. It's like saying in GTA that several villains are going to die. No, of course they're not. But Doug doesn't die. Nothing bad happens to him that we know of. And since Far Cry 4 has since come out and is actually connected to the same universe, the same setting in a concrete way, arguably for the first time. I know there's references to Far Cry 2 and Far Cry 3, but there's the same character in Far Cry 3 and Far Cry 4. Doing the same job, I might add, and referencing Far Cry 3. So considering that, we might have, or at least the developers had the possibility of telling us what bad stuff happened to Doug, and we hear nothing. Not a peep, not a hint. The man willing to sell off random strangers to become sex slaves gets off scot-free. Knowingly, by the way, willingly. What's really depressing is the idea that Doug probably gets a relatively small amount of money for doing that. That actually ties into the major theme of this game, which I'll be covering over the course of this rumination. Now, I'm going to talk about gameplay very briefly. There's gameplay. Okay, now I'm going to move on. No, seriously, though, the gameplay, I know it, I try... Okay, little history lesson. For those of you who don't know, when I first started doing these videos, before I actually started getting paid for doing these videos, I would talk about a game's story to the point of exclusion. I would not even mention the gameplay. And several of my viewers at the time, and at the time I had like 30, so when several of my viewers say something I was listening to them, said, why don't you talk about the gameplay of these games too? I'm kind of disappointed you didn't. So I made an active effort, and have done so ever since, to at least comment on the gameplay to some extent or another when I'm discussing a game. I did that in Dark Souls, I did that in Portal. I've been doing it ever since. I really made the effort this time, but I don't have anything to say about the gameplay. It's a first-person sandbox shooter. You point, you shoot, and there's a lot of quick-time events. And that's it. That's all I've got. The best thing I could say is that the gameplay is never used to the detriment of the story or vice versa. The gameplay is always an active and integral component into your character and into the way the overall story is progressing. And I think that was an awesome design choice and one of the things they did very, very well when it comes to Far Cry 3. But the actual gameplay portion of running around the island and sicking animals on people and taking over places and whatnot, I don't have anything to say about it. It's there. I'm sorry. So for the first time, really, I have failed on this endeavor. Back to the story. I've got tons to talk about the story. Far Cry 3 is probably one of the most textbook examples of to become monsters. Or to fight monsters, excuse me. To fight monsters. It's the same concept. The idea is in order to fight monsters, you must become monsters. Now, this has its roots all the way back again in most of the Greek tragedies, plays, and otherwise written works that most people consider the foundation of modern storytelling. Whether that's true or not is irrelevant. The point is, I mention that because it's an old idea. We've been doing this for a while. I don't actually personally agree with the idea. However, it is undeniable that in most circumstances, especially circumstances that are trying to be realistic in any format and not try to be romanticized or to, be idealized or anything like that, yeah, it is very likely that in order to fight something that is truly a monster, especially amongst a fellow sapient being, you too have to be willing to do monstrous acts. Not to name drop it again, but World War Z covered that very clearly. Don't forget that gentleman who came up with that horrible, horrible plan ended up committing suicide. Because he was a monster and he knew it. So, yeah. Throughout the course of this game, the most obvious thing I could comment on, and the thing everybody knows about this game, is the fact that you kind of become a psychopath over the course of it. The only thing I want to add to that, I just talked about this when it came to Portal, how hesitant I get to talk about a famous game because I don't know if I have anything new to add to the table. So forgive me if I'm repeating things you already know or have thought of or heard otherwise, but for me, I think the reason this journey worked is twofold. Number one, despite the fact that I commented I beat the game relatively quickly, it was still, there was no and then you're evil! It was more like this, the whole progression from running, struggling kid who has no idea what's going on and is adrenaline pumped and desperate and afraid and just trying to survive to basically being the king of Island Town and being able to curb stomp anything and everyone around him was a smooth progression. It was all natural. They actually do some really good tutorializing in this game because it all makes sense. You, the player, are introduced to these elements of, this is what you do in order to sneak, this is what you do in order to do a takedown move, etc. Literally because the character is also being introduced to that as well. The idea that your character, Jason, couldn't even think of his name, has never done any of this stuff before, so he is literally learning as you are. And again, he starts off with, oh god, and he keeps dropping comments every now and again, and it's a gradual thing. He starts off like, oh, I can't believe I did this. First person he kills, he freaks out completely about it. Later on, he gets to the point where he kills someone, and someone else is like, you just kill him? He's like, oh, yeah, I guess I did, kind of blasé about it. Later on, even still, I'm jumping, but the game doesn't, is my point. Later on, even still, he says, killing feels like winning. He does this wonderful progression into the monster thing, and indeed that's kind of related to the overall overarching theme of the piece. The other interesting thing about Far Cry 3 is it is a wonderful deconstruction in a kind of there's almost no way to say this. It's kind of a hipster, elitist, kind of a way. But it is there, and I feel like it needs to be acknowledged, because Far Cry 3 serves as a deconstruction of how violent and horrible video games can be, and how desensitized players themselves tend to get towards the idea of running around and butchering people in horrible, horrible ways. The idea that we are so accustomed to that because it's fake and fantasy, and that's okay, therefore serves in the game as the character is totally desensitized to it. But it's not okay in his case. And I say it's a partial deconstruction, or at least I meant to say that, I don't know if I actually said that or not, is because at no point in time, and this is fascinating, at no point in time does Far Cry 3 actually glorify its violence. Never. The player themselves, again, interpretively, can decide how fun it is to butcher people, or how much they despise it, or how much it's a necessity, or whatever. At no point does the game say, look at how awesome it is as you rip this guy's arms off. This is not God of War here. But quite the contrary. The effect this has on Jason and his friends is very powerful and very impacting, and it's just right there in your face, showing, if anything, how incredibly horrible violence really is. In the, I'm just going to call it this, the good ending, his claim that, no more blood, no more violence, just shows how broken of a shell he's become at so much exposure to that violence. Think about how many people he's killed at that point in time. There's a reason real-life soldiers who have killed tend to go through not only therapy, but more therapy than other soldiers, and a more intensive form thereof, because, I'm sorry, killing is a horrible thing, really. In real life, in a real concept, no, that's horrible. And I think that I like the fact that the game acknowledges and really focuses on that so strongly. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I guess this does segue into my next point on my list here. There is, in my opinion, interpretation, no possible way Jason can reintegrate to society at this point. This is why I say both endings are bad. I called the previous ending the good ending, but my point behind that is the ending, for those of you who don't know, spoiler alert in 3, 2, 1. The two endings are, you either, break free, go back to civilization, save your friends, or kill your girlfriend by slitting her throat, and then probably kill all your friends. We're not shown that on screen, but that's very likely what happens. And then get stabbed in the chest immediately after impregnating a woman. I know it's more complicated than that, but my point is, I'm pretty sure the second one is the bad ending in that category. But for other reasons too, which I'll get back to in just a moment. But this is another way this is the Greek tragedy thing. The whole point of a Greek tragedy is it doesn't end well. And the protagonist's life does not end well no matter what happens in Far Cry 3. If he chooses to escape and save his friends are going to have to go through years of therapy and adjustment. And they didn't go through nearly as much as he did. In my honest opinion, I don't think Jason will ever successfully reintegrate into society, not after all he went through. No, it is much more likely that he will either A, be trying and constantly keeping up this veneer of integration to society until something happens, and it doesn't even matter what, that makes him snap, which basically ruins and destroys his life or actually kills him. B, he tries to go back to society and finds it disgusting and deplorable, and then snaps, and then it's the end of his life. Or C, he goes back and spends the rest of his life constantly struggling to integrate into something that at this point is utterly alien to him, and never being able to be free of the guilt, conscience, etc. that plagues him in the past. So, destruction, death, or ruin are our options here. Yeah, it's not a good ending. And as I already mentioned in the other ending, you just die. Pretty quickly, actually. You get stabbed in the stomach, and then you get speeched at for a bit. The island itself, I already talked about the hallucination thing, but the island is a wonderful melting pot of crazy. Really, it's everywhere. It's debatable if anyone on the island is not crazy to some extent or another, but it's fascinating how many of them actually demonstrate it, because there's three main characters I want to talk about with regards to just the crazy element. The first one is Voss. Voss is interesting because Voss is a very special form of insane, in my opinion. Voss is the main character. No, I'm not implying a Fight Club thing here. But Voss is someone who got in over his head and ended up dealing with some hallucinogenic properties and dealing with a lot of violence and killing a lot of people. And all of this is, of course, obvious. In fact, the developers have gone on record as saying that your path throughout the game is to make you into a new Voss. They've been pretty upfront about this. It's very obvious. So Voss is someone who went through what you went through, and he chose to stay. The only difference is he didn't have a woman trying to stab him to death after he had sex with her. So Voss is exactly what is happening to the player character. You see it throughout the whole game. It's so obvious. The first few scenes he's there, it's just you are literally looking into a mirror in so many ways. It's just a mirror that sees just a little bit into the future, as he is a broken shell of a man who is just barely trying to make some semblance of sense out of all that violence and all that killing, because you can see the instability all over him, in his tone, in his posture. Wonderful work. What was it? I wrote his name down. Michael Mando is the gentleman who played him, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. But he adds so much wonderful life and flavor to the character because you can almost sympathize with him. Not really. I mean, he's a monster, but you can. It's not sympathy. It's pity. That's the word. You look at him and you feel pity. Not just because you're going through the same thing, but because virtually anyone would go through the same thing. Just about any person who was put through that hell and told to make those choices over and over again would probably snap just like he did. The interesting thing about it is there's sort of a perpetuity. Perpetuity? I'm not trying to pronounce that. Perpetual thing going on here on the island, and it's actually tied into the very mythos of the island itself. In case you don't know what I'm talking about, the idea is that the system is actually the problem, and that everyone involved is just perpetuating it. And so, and it's always about the outsider concept. For those of you who don't know, again, the Chinese showed up, but then they went crazy, but then they got taken over by the Japanese who came up, then they went crazy, and this cycle repeats until Hoyt shows up, who goes crazy, and then you show up and go crazy. It's always an outsider displacing another outsider, and that's always a measure of the system. And I mentioned the mythos, the way that this works into it. Remember that whole story about the giant who was killed by a prince from another land? Yeah. Now, the reason I bring that up especially, though, and I want to talk about this only briefly because this is a topic that applies to real life more than most things I talk about do. The greatest problem of a system is that it averts blame. Think about this for a moment. I have said many times that the flaw in insert blank here is in the system that perpetuates it. There's no individual you can point to and say, you are the one at fault. You are the one who needs to be removed or fixed or integrated or whatever. Forgive me for name dropping something kind of off topic here, but Logan's Run is probably the single most extreme example I've ever seen of this, where there were no actual dictators or leaders or anything perpetuating the system. It was literally just the system. But the problem is the system doesn't exist. Okay? System is a word. Like culture, like politics. These are words that explain ideals and concepts between people, but there is nothing literally there, okay? I know this is a strange topic, but bear with me. The point is, because you can just say the system, you can just point to the system and say, well, that's to blame. The problem here is a lot of the people who perpetuate the system then do exactly that. I have no choice. I'm just doing my job. I couldn't change it if I wanted to. I'm just one person. The problem with a system that perpetuates something as horrible and vicious as what happens in Far Cry 3, and I'm going to stick to the fictional example because I really don't want to get in real life stuff here, is that system is the fault of everyone helping to keep it going. Hoyt himself actually name drops, it's just the system, that's the way the system's designed. He is just as much to blame as his soldiers are for their perpetuation of it, for their willing continuation of it. People can and have changed systems in the past. We've seen this a few trillion times, slight exaggeration, across real-life human history. That's how systems change, actually. When enough people, or strong enough people, or both, decide, no, I'm not going to keep this crap going. So they try to stop it, and sometimes they fail. And sometimes they succeed. But either way, the real problem with Far Cry 3 is it's one of the clearest examples I've seen in a long time of the system is to blame, but no, it's really the people. All the people. Right, Voss. I want to talk about Michael Mando really quick. As I mentioned, he sells the role, totally. On paper, Voss and Hoyt, in my opinion, are equally interesting. They both have their own things. I'll talk about them basically last. I've actually got the very last. That's my very last note on the notes here. But my reason for bringing up Voss in this point, though, is most people agree that Voss is awesome, and then Hoyt's eh. And I know some people who have rather derogatorily claimed, in jest or otherwise, that you beat the villain of the game halfway through, and then you meander through the second half. Two comments about that. Number one, the reason for that is Michael Mando. For those of you who don't know, Voss did not exist when Michael Mando came in to do his audition. They had a totally different character in mind for the character that eventually became Voss. Voss was created because Mando sold the role. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. Sold the role so well, and they found him. He's a very charismatic gentleman. If you ever seen him off camera, or indeed in real life, you can see what I mean. But you don't even have to need that. You can hear it in his voice. He portrays himself very well. And so he has a lot of charisma, a lot of energy, and he really sold the role. It's kind of a Kefka effect, if you will. Yeah, sure, Kefka is this nightmarish, horrible monster, but he has enough charisma and entertainment value to him that you don't boo when he comes on the screen. You want to see more of him. Same thing with Voss. And that's exactly how the developers reacted when they saw Michael Mando the first time. They're like, dude, And so they made this character based off him. If you've ever seen a picture of him next to Voss, it's yeah. And that's kind of how Voss became. Now, the thing is, I don't know if they did this deliberately or not. I'd like to believe they did, because there's actually a lot of subtlety in this game. But what they did was they made Voss the big climax of the game. And then you kill Voss, spoiler alert. But then the game just kind of slides into ruin. And a lot of people have been like, the second half of the game is crap. But honestly, the second half of the game was just as engaging for me, just in a different way. Because most games do this. Or this, depending on tone and approach. Like most epic RPGs do the up thing. You're constantly building the thread and building the scale and building this epic, right? Lord of the Rings thing. Horror games and whatnot, they descend. Things get darker and drearier and more doomy or more gross or more violent or whatever. But the point is, it's an escalation. Far Cry 3 actually does this for the first half of the game and then does this for the second half, which is very unusual, actually, for a game to pull off, I might add. But the whole point of it is that is very keeping with the theme of the overall game. Which I'm actually going to go ahead and leave aside for a second, because I got two other things I want to talk about before I really get into the theme, and otherwise. Because I only have a few other things to talk about, I swear. First of all, let's talk about the Tatao. Tatao. I'm terrible at pronunciations, everybody knows this. The Tatao, here's a question for you. As with everything, it is left into interpretation whether or not it actually is. So I just want to give my own 3 thoughts on the matter. Number 1, the human body can push itself to do things it basically shouldn't be able to do under duress. The idea of being able to grip a rock face as you're plummeting down it. The concept of lifting up something very heavy that you normally wouldn't be able to in order to save someone you care about. Now, those kind of things do happen, are documented, etc. This is real, actual science. The catch that most people tend to forget is that people can only do that because the body, under certain stimuli, is willing to ignore the damage it can do to itself. What most people don't understand is the human body, it can accomplish incredible things, but it doesn't do so normally because doing so would literally be self-destructive, damaging to tendons and bones and nerves and blood vessels and circulatory systems in your lungs, and you literally are damaging yourself, hurting yourself, lifting that thing or grabbing that rock or whatever. It is only in the moment you can accomplish that. Why do I bring this up? We've already established this island has tons of hallucinatory things and good drugs and all sorts of other things and toxins. Is it not so out of bounds to assume that this tattoo, which is built into you, is literally just another thing of that manner, which is artificially inducing in you the ability to constantly push yourself? I love this idea because not only does it make sense in a very literal and fundamental way, I don't mean fundamental, but in a very mundane, down-to-earth way, but it also kind of explains the path of your character arc. You're constantly getting better and killing and doing all this stuff, and then you die. Or you rot. Because you've basically destroyed yourself. You've literally, never mind the damage to your psyche and your friendships and all that stuff. You have basically ruined your body for the remainder of its days. It would also make a lot of sense as to why, I suddenly can't think how to pronounce her name, Citra, decides to go ahead and kill you in the end. Because she knows that you can't keep doing what you've been doing. And so she is preserving you now, giving you a warrior's death rather than letting you, slowly rot away on the table, killing you in your prime, in other words. And then your child will be the new, kind of a person. Second thought, it is mystical. It is actually supernatural in some manner or another. Magic, aliens, psychonetic powers, whatever. Use whatever explanation you want. It doesn't matter. Point is, past the natural, supernatural. That's the term. And I don't think there's anything that needs to be explained there, but I do like the fact that there's enough hints throughout the course of the game, mostly in lore and flavor and side quests, that hint to the fact that there could be a supernatural aspect to the islands, but it's not definitive. Again, that whole interpretive thing coming back in. So, again, it could literally be enhancing your power, making you more durable, making you be able to do all this stuff, etc. Leads me to option 3. Wouldn't it be interesting if it was both? What if there was some mystical force once upon a time on this place that taught the people how to utilize the local land and the local plants in just such a way to enhance their lesser bodies, their human bodies, in order to bring them more up to scale to its level? Just food for thought. I like the first idea best, which is why I talked about it the most. Second thing I want to talk about, speaking of the whole Tatao thing, the Rakyat. God, I am terrible at pronunciations. Is fascinating to me because their culture makes perfect sense in its own horrible way. First of all, let's think about why it spread so much. Number 1, perpetuation from locals. This is obvious. The people in that area are A, affected by the constant toxic air, B, more inclined to cling to more tribal ideals and ideologies and functions rather than anything else because, well, the outsiders are constantly, more or less literally raping and pillaging the land in order to, be evil because they belong to Weyland-Yutani, I believe. And so it makes sense that you would try to find not only some identity but some form of protection amongst them. So, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And, of course, they're traditionalist in their own way, and not to put too fine a point on it, but the more Weyland-Yutani the outsiders tend to be, the more insular the Rakyat are going to be, which means they're going to get more traditionalist and less progressive, which means they're going to get into the bubble syndrome, right? And indeed, I'm pretty sure by the time the game has begun, they're already there. That brings us, of course, to the other reason why their culture and their society would spread so much, and that is because they offer an interesting interesting alternative to everyday mundane life. How many people from the outside world would come here and, having been disillusioned with their job, or their military, or their country, or their people, or the world at whole, would find this simple tribal lifestyle of we stick to each other, we stick together, we take care of each other, we defend our own, as appealing? It's actually not even that hard to understand why that's appealing, especially on the face of it. Especially given most people probably wouldn't think past the face of it at first and would say, yes, I want to join. And then after a while of getting used to it, it would be easier for them to acclimate to it and adjust to it, and to mentally get past some of the horrible things that they do, because they're part of the tribe now, and the tribe is taking care of them, so it's natural that they ask something in return, etc., etc. It's also one of the reasons I find it most fascinating that the Rakyat absolutely demand the cutting off of all ties past the island. They don't want any possibility of A, you being tempted to leave and, reduce their numbers, which would lead to a whole desertion problem. I talked about that during the Dragon Age video. But also B, because this way, literally, physically, fundamentally, there's no one out there for you to leave to and no one to come to you, so you emotionally and mentally know you are now here, you are now part of the tribe. It's identity assassination. It's something Rome used to do, and indeed in Fallout New Vegas, something Rome does as well, the Caesar's Legion. In order to force you to become part of this new whole, they literally kill as much as they can, your previous identity. Hence why you had to kill your girlfriend. God, that's such a horrible scene. I can't imagine anybody who'd look at that and say, I can't wait to slit her throat. Anyways, go ahead, tell me you did it. But yeah, that's why you had to kill your friends and your girlfriend, because you had to cut off all ties outside the island to become part of the tribe, and then be murdered. This is one of the reasons I find Dennis to be such an interesting character. In my opinion, he is probably the example of this mentality. We know very little about him, but we do know he was U.S. Marine Corps. And he does have that kind of pseudo-military bearing. We also know he had kind of a screwed-up early childhood, which is why he went to the United States to begin with. Disillusionment with where he came from. Could probably been also assumed he had disillusionment where he was then, in the Marine Corps, doing horrible things, or maybe giving bogus orders, or having politics get involved. It's not hard to imagine someone in the military being evil. It's so commonplace, it was a cliche for years, that nowadays is a little more averted. But, I mean, for God's sakes, you know, at one point in time you just point to a military officer and say, you're evil because you're military. This is all a result of cultural fascination with anti-militarism that kind of came about immediately during and following the Vietnam War, but I digress. Point being, it wouldn't be hard for him to be disillusioned with that life, leading him here and to embrace this new life. Again, a perfect example of that kind of outsider mentality, genuinely wanting to be a part of this new life. That's not even mentioning the romantic feelings he had for her, which probably had something to do with it too, but let's just get on with that. So let's talk about my last 2 points. I told you I didn't have that much to share, and I do apologize for that. I never exactly sit down and say, I'm going to talk for 45 minutes and 32 seconds. I just talk until I'm out of things to say. But I always try to leave the big stuff for last, so here we go. I've been hinting at this whole time, the big theme. The big theme is everyone is a coin. No, seriously, bear me out here, okay? The 2 endings adhere to this perfectly, and I'm just going to explain it this way. You can have the choice of rejecting the monster and face the lifetime of insanity and mundanity and all the horribleness that being a human means. Or you can reject your humanity and become the monster, and then face the reality of being a monster and all the badness that means, including, of course, most naturally, being killed like a monster. Ultimately, that is really what happens to you. You won. Remember that last line? Think about it. The point here is that the whole island follows this example. The 2 sides of things, and it is best described, and I told you I'd get to this, in Voss and Hoyt. Voss is the man who was pretending to be a monster. Bear me out. I told you, he's someone who went insane, who was literally driven to madness by all the horrible things that happened to him and those around him. He was destroyed, mentally and emotionally, and he kept going and evolved and grew and became a monster, and pretended to be that monster because that's the only way things make sense. It's the only way to justify the killing and the horror and the torture and all the other horrible, horrible things that happened that he has witnessed and he has done. Remember, we only know the horrible things that we, the player character, have done. And we know that we aren't as bad as Voss and didn't get a chance to be as bad as Voss because it's a shorter journey, right? I just bring that up because among the many things we do, I just feel like the most important one to mention is that we knowingly and willingly torture our younger brother. Granted, we do it to maintain a facade, but that's not the part that matters, and you know that. That's an excuse you can tell yourself after the fact. The human being, Jason, still knows that he tortured his younger brother. What did Voss go through? So, Voss is that concept of humanity being destroyed and maintaining this facade. And ultimately, that is probably the best description of insanity I've ever heard. Yes, I know, he gives his whole definition of an insanity thing. And to be honest, it's a great speech. No argument there. Probably the highlight of the whole movie, the game, in my opinion. But that is not the definition of insanity, not really. That's an anecdote. Insanity, in my definition, in my opinion, is when your brain cannot function due to information it has accessible to it. And it responds in many different ways. But it does respond. It doesn't just keep going, it doesn't adapt. It alters its programming. And what Voss did was he threw up a facade, big old mask, of this crazed, violent lunatic. Because that's what everything else was doing. That's what he had been forced to do. Them or me. Them or me. Remember he was talking about that? Keep having to make that choice. Kill them or die yourself. well, this way it makes sense. I'll just be this horrible person. I'm not saying Voss, at his core, was a good person. Don't mistake. I'm saying that at his core, he was a human, not a monster. This leads us to the other side of the coin. This thing. Hoyt. Despite everything, even though Voss is a way more interesting character and much more engaging on the screen, like I said, I found Hoyt more interesting intellectually because Hoyt is the monster pretending to be a human. He is a despicable, loathsome, ruthless, terrible person who bothers to make excuses for his actions and for what he does, refusing to take any responsibility for anything or any of his actions, and constantly trying to justify the ridiculously vile and horrible acts he does, callously and without mercy or pity. At no point in time is there a shred of conscience or decency in him. Not even for a millisecond. He is a monster, pretending to be a man. Or human, or whatever. I mean, he is male, I think. He might have been female, I don't know. But yeah, he's despicable. And yet it's interesting to me, because in the modern era, the only way a monster can actually function in society is by putting on that mask of being a human and then pretending to play like all the other humans do. So that you can then do what it is you want to do. The system that he kept berating allows for people like him because the commodities that he pushes out and in are things that are valued by other aspects of society. And I'm not talking about the slaves, believe it or not. Mostly the drug trade and the money, respectively. Yes, that's right, money is actually a commodity. I know a lot of people tend to forget that because it's, the method of currency, but really money itself in modern economies, like the one in Far Cry 3, is itself a commodity, is something that is valued basically for its own sake in many cases. And for good reasons. For reasonable reasons. I'm not going to call them good. So his function in that makes a perfect amount of sense. And yet, I cannot help but comment on how unnecessary it all is. If Hoyt and the system, that particular system, and all that drug trade and all that slave trade were wiped from reality, the rest of society would move on without incident. That's really the really screwed up part of this, because a system will allow growths onto it that are not necessary for its own self-perpetuation. A system only requires very few simple things. I don't want to really go into structured dynamics here. I don't really want to talk about that, because it would take forever. But the point I'm trying to make is that I mentioned earlier the whole, the system is the problem. No, the people are the problem, because people will look at a system and say, how can I exploit that? How can I use that? How can I make it better for me? And that's what people like Hoyt do, to a frankly extreme degree, to the point where you get this sex, slave, drug, violence, kidnapping, ransom, hostage plan thing of which I don't even know how to put. For God's sakes, he kidnaps people, ransoms them, and then sells them as slaves. I'm going to say that again. He kidnaps people, ransoms them, and then sells them as slaves. That's deplorable. The system does not need that to exist. It doesn't. And I guess that's all I've got there, but the final point I want to mention is, I mentioned this game is very interpretive. Obviously my interpretation is much more mundane, down to earth, etc. I call Hoyt a monster, but I don't mean that literally. I don't mean he's a Dalek underneath that skin suit or whatever. I mean he's a monster. Metaphorical, if you will. But isn't it interesting that it is possible, with the way Far Cry 3 is presented, that someone like Hoyt, a perpetuator of, shall we say, cancerous growths onto the system, could literally be a monster? Like that giant, once upon a time. Someone who, like the theoretical thing that gave the Tatao, could be something that is trying to make things worse because, well, who knows why, really. And therefore literally wears the guise of a man in order to interact with and ruin and try to bring horror and death and all those other terrible things to society. Isn't that an interesting thought for you? Bottom line, Far Cry 3 is a really depressing game. I need to stop playing depressing games. Oh my god. Let's see, what's next on the list? Dying Light, Metro Last Light, Everyone's Gonna Die Tomorrow, Barbie's Mall Adventure. That's it, I'm out. I'm kidding. I'll see you guys around.